Here, and in this video I am going to be introducing using models to construct explanations specifically for our unit on the process of photosynthesis. Alright, so our question in our experiment that we did earlier was, does the amount of CO2 affect the rate of photosynthesis? From our graph we see as CO2 increases, the amount of bubbles, which is a measure of oxygen, increases, right, a product of photosynthesis, so yes, it does. Alright, now what we want to know now is why. Why does the amount of CO2 affect the rate of photosynthesis? So what we could do is we could kind of draw a picture of what's going on to help us better understand why we see the results that we do, why CO2 helps with this. All right, so in the space below, create a model to show the impact of CO2 level on the rate of photosynthesis. There's a high amount of light and water are present in both chambers and are held constant. Be sure to include all reactants, products, and the location of the chemical reaction, as well as labels in your model. Okay, so what we have here is this is split down the middle, and what we're trying to do is we're going to compare in the experiment. We obviously looked at multiple levels, but let's just look at the extremes, or a low level of CO2 and a high level of CO2. So this is modeling the low level, and this is modeling the high level. All right. This is also modeling the low level. This is also modeling the high level. The difference is this is a macro scale. Think of macro like a Big Mac, so just a larger scale. And this is micro, like a microscope. So we are really zooming in here. So we're still comparing low versus high. We're just doing it at two different scales. Let's start at the macro level. Because it's a macro level, right? What scale is that going to be? It's going to be like we're looking at a leaf right here. So I'm going to draw a leaf, and I'll draw another leaf here. Okay. And as I'm modeling photosynthesis, I want to show where it happens, the location. So at the macro level, we could just say leaf. We could even say plant cell. I'd be fine with that. And then we want to look at our reactants and products. And we know that our reactants of photosynthesis are CO2 and water and light. So I'm putting energy, but we could specify that as solar energy. And it says that there are high amounts of light in H2O. So I'm going to draw, to show that there are high amounts of light, I'm going to draw a thick arrow here to represent the high amounts of that specific thing, energy. And then high amounts of the mass water. Right? But then since this is the low CO2 level, I want to model that. And I'm going to do that by just drawing a small arrow. So we got a lot of water and light, but very little CO2. So now we have to think in a cause and effect mindset. What's going to happen? Think about our pancake analogy, where maybe I have plenty of eggs and milk, but I don't have a lot of pancake mix. Right? If I'm limited in something, I'm not going to have as many products. So our products of photosynthesis, we know, are glucose and oxygen. And because I have a limited reactant right here of CO2, I'm just not going to get as much glucose. I'm not going to get as many bubbles. All right? That explains that why when we have a low level of CO2, we just don't have as many oxygen bubbles here. All right? So now let's model a high CO2 level. Remember, the high amount of light and H2O are held constant in both chambers, so I'm going to do the same thing here. Write our reactants of photosynthesis, energy, solar, and we got a high amount of both solar and energy and H2O here for our reactants. But since this is a high CO2 level, right, in contrast to just a low amount of CO2 here, we're going to draw a thicker line to show that more CO2 is going into this leaf compared to the CO2 in the other process. All right, so now in our pancake model, if I have plenty of pancake mix, eggs, and milk, I'm going to be able to make plenty of pancakes and the scraps. So it's the same thing with photosynthesis. Plenty of reactants. I am going to get plenty of glucose and plenty of O2. And I could, at least in my macro model, a way that I could do that is by drawing those thicker arrows right here. All right. So again, what we've been able to explain is when I have more CO2, all right, because it's a reactant, that allows us to make more oxygen bubbles. So not only do I know that CO2 does increase photosynthesis, through my model, I've been able to show why. Okay, so at this point, we've made a great model. Like, this is fine as is, and sometimes I'll just have you do a macro model. All right, but I also want to we also sometimes want to model this at a different scale, maybe a more of a microscopic scale. So it's going to be essentially the same idea, main concept. We're just going to zoom in. We're almost like looking at the actual molecules themselves. So for CO2, there's a low amount of CO2. I'm going to draw a CO2 molecule. If you're wondering how you draw it or how you know, I'm telling you right now. And you can kind of use this page as your notes or reference of how you'll draw CO2 or any of these other molecules. Because it's a low level, I'm only going to draw one molecule. And then, just like we had before, we have high amounts of water and light. So I'm going to draw that by just drawing multiple water molecules. Remember, water is H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. And I'm going to draw these atoms connected together like this. Now for the light, it's not mass, so we can't really draw mass, but maybe I could draw like these just flashes right here. And since there's a high amount of light, just like I drew 3 water molecules, 3 light patches. And then I'm going to draw an arrow here. And what the arrow does is it helps separate the reactants from the products. All right, now before, remember, we also want to talk about the location. So here's the leaf. All right, if we're zoomed in, all right, we could be in a plant cell, but more specifically within the plant cell, we're in that organelle, that structure of the cell that's specifically responsible for photosynthesis. It's like the factory called the chloroplast. So this is where this is going down. All right, so if I have, again, even though I have plenty of water and plenty of sunlight, not a lot of CO2, so that's only going to make me so much glucose. So I'm going to draw maybe 1 glucose molecule and 1 oxygen molecule. Remember, oxygen's O2, so 2 oxygen molecules bond together. This is how we draw oxygen, water, and CO2. And glucose, we just make as a hexagon to keep things fairly simple. Right. So now modeling the high level of CO2, right, instead of drawing 1 CO2 molecule, I just want to draw more than 1 CO2 molecule. I could draw 2, and that would be fine as long as it's more than the low amount, right? I'm going to draw 3, though. By the way, if you wanted to draw 4, you could do that too. It's up to you, as long, again, as you're showing that difference, low amount of CO2 versus high amount. And then I'm going to keep everything, because it says so, constant, same amount of water, and the same amount of light. Just represented as these like light patches here. It's kind of tough to model something like energy versus matter. All right. So here again are my reactants and my products on the other side. And again, it all takes place in the chloroplast. If you just did this once right here, I don't need you to repeat it again. I want to take off or something like that. But just first, make sure that we're clear. I'm going to rewrite it here. All right. So now that I've got plenty of CO2, just like I did in my macromolecule, or my macro model, right, where because I had more CO2, I had more products, I'm going to do the same exact thing here. More CO2 and more of everything else is going to give me more glucose. I'm going to draw, because I drew 3 of everything here, I'll just draw 3 glucose here. And same thing with oxygen, more oxygen. And again, it's because I have more reactants, I get more products. All right. And even though I have plenty of reactants for water and light, not a lot of CO2, so not a lot of products. All right. So again, in both of these cases, we've been able to explain that when you have less reactants, you get less products, and that explains why when CO2 concentration increases, when my reactants and photosynthesis go up, so do my products. The rate of photosynthesis goes up as well. So use this video, use this sheet as kind of your target sheet, as your note sheet, to complete the other experiments, specifically experiment 2 and experiment 3, which are going to look really similar to this, but your amounts of different things might change based on reading your scenario. Thanks for watching, everyone.